Did people in the 1800s actually enjoy courting, or were they just performing enjoyment because a chaperone was watching? We are diving deep into the fascinating, sometimes absurd, history of human courtship, exploring how people have navigated the universal desire for connection from ancient contracts to modern apps. This is a journey through centuries of social rituals, changing technologies, and enduring human emotions, all drawn from a remarkably insightful historical overview.
That's a great question, Daniel, and it cuts right to the core of how courtship has evolved. For much of history, what we now call love wasn't the starting point for marriage at all. Marriage was simply a contract, practical and businesslike. In ancient and medieval societies, the idea that you might actually like the person you were bound to for life was often considered a charming bonus at best and a dangerous distraction at worst. Quote from the material. Parents arranged matches based on land, wealth, alliances, and social standing, much like comparing mortgage terms today, except the mortgage had a pulse and opinions.
It sounds incredibly impersonal. So a 16-year-old in a small village would just be told, "You're marrying the neighboring landowner's son?" No discussion of whether he's interesting or kind? Just, is this a good property arrangement?
Precisely. The question of compatibility or personal feelings simply wasn't the relevant metric. The relevant metric was whether his family's fields were adjacent to yours or if the arrangement would prevent a property dispute. From a modern viewpoint, this might seem cruel, but it was considered responsible. Love, as an expectation before marriage, was something that happened after marriage if you were lucky. It wasn't the foundation. It was, at best, a pleasant afterthought. End quote.
A pleasant afterthought. That's a stark contrast to our current romantic ideals, and it seems this pattern held across cultures, even with the church adding its layer of sanctity to marriage in medieval Europe, so no choice for the individuals involved?
Almost none. A young noblewoman in 13th century France was as unlikely to choose her own husband as she was her own surname. Yet, remarkably, even within these arranged setups, love sometimes blossomed. Letters survive from medieval and early modern couples that are surprisingly tender. People found ways to care for the person they'd been assigned, making the best of it because they often had to.
That's a powerful point. Making the best of it versus having a choice. It truly highlights how recent the idea of romance as a prerequisite for marriage really is. So if choice wasn't part of the package, what about the earliest stages of getting to know someone in these highly structured societies?
That brings us to perhaps the figure who has done more unsung damage to the early stages of romance than any other in history. Quote, the chaperone. In the Victorian era and well beyond, no respectable young woman could be left unchaperoned with a man she wasn't related to. This meant the initial stages of courtship played out as a kind of absurdist theater, end quote. Everyone performed polite indifference, hoping the chaperone would, perhaps, fall asleep.
Absurdist theater. That's a perfect description. Trying to express romantic interest while a bored relative is knitting 3 feet away sounds incredibly difficult. What were the actual rules of this system?
The rules were elaborate and, frankly, somewhat deranged, end quote. A young woman couldn't walk unchaperoned with a man not in her immediate family, couldn't ride alone in a closed carriage with him, and certainly not be alone with him after dark without her reputation being destroyed. The chaperone was the physical embodiment of these rules, ensuring they were followed and witnessing that nothing scandalous occurred.
It sounds like communication became a highly coded art form. You couldn't say what you meant directly, so everything else acquired immense weight.
Exactly. A brushed hand while passing a teacup became significant enough to think about for 3 days, end quote. Every public occasion was a highly coded performance in which the real conversation happened entirely below the surface of the spoken one. This system, in some ways, produced a romantic intensity modern directness has lost. When words are constrained, a prolonged glance or a specific flower takes on immense meaning. However, it's crucial not to romanticize it too heavily. The chaperone system was fundamentally a mechanism for controlling women, end quote, designed to protect her virtue as a commodity, end quote, ensuring her value for a future husband. The men, of course, operated with considerably more freedom.
So it was less about protecting the young woman and more about protecting her value on the marriage market. That's a harsh but probably accurate assessment. And before texting or even letters, how did someone even initiate contact in this highly regulated environment?
You sent a calling card. This was a small, formally printed rectangle with just your name, sometimes your address, and nothing else. It was hand-delivered by a servant, left on a silver tray, and expected to do all the emotional heavy lifting on its own, end quote. Whether she was home, whether she received the card, or chose to receive you on a return visit, all of it was a coded performance governed by strict rules.
So even the way the card was presented or folded had meaning? That's an incredible level of formality for what is essentially an invitation to talk.
Absolutely. Folding a corner of the card in a specific direction indicated that you had delivered it in person, end quote, implying greater sincerity. Different corners meant different things. If you got it wrong, you might accidentally convey congratulations when you meant condolences. If the lady chose not to receive you, her servant would say she was not at home, end quote, a polite fiction everyone understood. You'd leave, understanding you'd been evaluated and found insufficient.
That's a lot of social scaffolding just to get two people in the same room. A modern first date lasts an hour or more, and we still feel it's insufficient. They had 15 minutes under observation, right?
15 to 30 minutes to make your case, conduct yourself well, and leave a favorable impression, end quote. All under the watchful eye of a chaperone. It was a system that demanded seriousness of intention, end quote. You didn't go through all that for nothing. And speaking of unusual practices, one of the strangest in early American history was bundling.
Bundling? That sounds intriguing. What exactly did that entail?
It involved a courting couple being placed in the same bed together, often with a wooden board between them, or the young woman sewn into a bundling bag from the waist down, then left largely unsupervised for the night. The logic was pragmatic. Heating a colonial home was expensive, so this allowed a suitor to stay overnight and converse without wasting firewood, and theoretically without impropriety.
A wooden board in the same bed with the young woman sewn into a bag. That's a lot of faith to put in a piece of lumber and some stitching. And human virtue, I suppose. I can't imagine this always went according to plan.
It didn't always. While the bundling board was the star of the arrangement, end quote, often being more symbolic than structural, it was meant to do a great deal of moral work for a piece of lumber, end quote. What it actually produced, according to records, was a great deal of very earnest conversation, end quote. Long nights in the dark, talking in ways they couldn't in daylight. Names, plans, fears, opinions, whether they could build a life together. The darkness and closeness produced an intimacy that parlor visits never could.
So, in a strange way, it fostered a deeper connection despite the bizarre setup. But it also sounds like a recipe for unintended consequences. What did the observers of the time say?
18th century observers who were not pleased about this, quote, noted a notable rate of premarital pregnancy in communities where it was practiced, end quote. Puritan ministers thundered against it. Colonial assemblies discussed legislating against it, but it persisted because families with cold houses and inconveniently located suitors were more pragmatic. It faded as homes became better heated and more formal practices emerged, but it lasted long enough for descendants to be horrified by it generations later.
A practical solution with significant social implications. So if you weren't bundling and calling cards were for the elite, how else did people express interest from a distance before modern communication?
Before the read receipt, there was the love letter. For centuries, it was the primary technology of romantic pursuit, end quote, carrying enormous psychological weight. You couldn't unsend it. Whatever you wrote was a permanent document that could be kept, shared, or even used as evidence in a breach of promise lawsuit, end quote.
Breach of promise lawsuits? That's a new one. So if you proposed and then backed out, you could be sued?
Yes, a legitimate and surprisingly common feature of Victorian and Edwardian legal life, end quote. Almost always, women filed these suits against men who had promised to marry them and then didn't. They could sue for damages for money spent on wedding preparations, lost income from turning down other suitors, and reputational harm. The law recognized that a woman who announced an engagement had removed herself from the marriage market, invested time and emotion, and was left materially and socially worse off if the man withdrew.
That truly highlights the economic vulnerability of women in that era. It wasn't just about a broken heart, it was about a potentially ruined life. And these cases were apparently quite public.
They were. Breach of promise cases were reliably entertaining, and newspapers covered them in the spirit in which modern media covers celebrity divorces. End quote. Damages awarded were sometimes enormous. It was an acknowledgement that romantic promises had real-world consequences. End quote. While built on assumptions about women's dependence, it also took seriously the idea that a broken promise could genuinely damage someone's heart and circumstances, a recognition that modern, commitment-free dating sometimes seems to abandon.
A fascinating contrast. So back to the love letter. The waiting must have been agonizing. Days, weeks for a reply, with no idea if it even arrived or what the recipient thought.
It was its own torture. The letter existed in a state of pure uncertainty, end quote, until a reply came. A prompt reply was encouraging, a slow one ambiguous, no reply at all was a message, and an unambiguous one, end quote. But what love letters gave you, uniquely, was a sense of the person on the page, end quote. Handwriting, the pressure of the pen, the style of capitals, all evidence of a specific human being sitting somewhere in a specific room with specific feelings, making choices about how to express them to you, end quote. It required commitment. You had to mean it enough to sit down and write it.
That friction, that effort, is a signal in itself. It's something we've lost in the age of instant digital communication. What about nonverbal signals? If direct talk was discouraged, how did people communicate more subtly?
They used florography, an entire system of coded communication using flowers, end quote. Each bloom carried a specific meaning, and a carefully assembled bouquet could communicate paragraphs of feeling without a single word being spoken, end quote. A red rose meant passionate love, but a yellow rose meant jealousy, a petunia, resentment, a striped carnation, refusal.
So you could accidentally send a bouquet that says, "I resent you and I'm jealous," when you meant, "I adore you." That adds a layer of anxiety to flower giving that we definitely don't have today.
Exactly. The implications of getting it wrong were significant. The flowers were a language, but like all languages, they were subject to regional variations and the ever-present problem of the sender and receiver having read different editions of the dictionary, end quote. Florography allowed people to say the unsayable, communicating romantic feeling in a form that could be received and understood without anyone having to admit out loud what was being communicated. If you received striped carnations, you at least had the dignity of receiving a rejection in a form that smelled better than a letter, end quote.
A scented rejection. That's certainly an upgrade from a read receipt. And what about meeting people? If you couldn't just walk up to someone and chat, what were the acceptable venues for these highly choreographed interactions?
The Sunday church service was a prime example. The entire community assembled, and you could observe and be observed in a setting where any overt display of romantic interest would be immediately witnessed by everyone, including your grandmother, end quote. The half hour after service in the churchyard was often the most productive social networking event of the entire week, end quote.
A masterclass in covert communication. And beyond church, what about other settings?
The chaperoned walk served a similar function. You'd walk with a young woman and her adult companion on a public path. These walks lasted long enough for the polished surface to wear slightly thin and something more genuine to emerge occasionally, end quote. The underlying anxiety across all these supervised encounters was how to determine if you genuinely liked someone when you were never allowed to be alone and every interaction was a performance.
It sounds like making a sincere connection was incredibly difficult. Yet these structures provided a kind of community knowledge about potential partners, right?
Yes. Everyone in a small parish or neighborhood had been observing the same pool of eligible people for years, end quote. Character, history, and family were known. The supervised encounter was just the formal part. The informal information had been accumulating for years. And then there was the parlor, the ultimate performance space, end quote, for early courtship.
The Victorian parlor. I imagine stiff chairs and even stiffer conversations. What was the goal of these interactions?
It was furnished with the family's best items, kept too warm, and presided over by a mother or aunt. Victorian parlor chairs were not designed for relaxation, end quote, but to communicate moral rectitude. What was said was almost comically inoffensive, end quote. The weather, health of acquaintances, the condition of the roads. You were conducting an extended audition in which the role you were auditioning for was your own future self, end quote. Yet, real information was transmitted. How someone sat, whether they listened, their humor. The parlor stripped away the physical setting and most of the behavioral cues that modern daters rely on, end quote. But it gave you conversation, and that gave you something.
So despite all the constraints, people still found ways to assess each other. It must have taken a keen eye and ear, and these rituals, like calling cards and parlors, were largely for the privileged classes, weren't they?
Almost exclusively. For the majority of people throughout history, courtship was a far more pragmatic affair, shaped less by the rituals of polite society and more by the grinding realities of economic survival, end quote. A working-class woman in the 1800s wasn't concerned with calling cards, but with a suitor's wages, whether he drank, and if marrying him would improve her situation. The dowry system, prevalent across cultures, made the economic dimension explicit. A bride's family transferred money or property to the groom's, partly for her welfare, but also as a payment for taking on a wife. The size of a dowry determined a great deal, end quote.
So a good dowry meant a better match, and a small one meant limited options. Love was secondary, if it entered the equation at all, until the financial terms were set.
Yes, love might enter into the calculation, end quote. But after the financial terms were established, for men without property, marriage was equally instrumental. A laboring man might wait until his late 20s or 30s to marry, until he had the economic foundation to support a household. Romance that couldn't be supported financially was simply a luxury he couldn't act on, end quote. Working-class courtship was direct. You met someone at work or church, assessed the practical basis for marriage, and proceeded with a handshake, an understanding between families, and a trip to the church. The sentiment was not absent, but it was not the point, end quote.
A powerful reminder that for most of history, marriage was about survival and practicalities, not romantic ideals. This pragmatism, though, it sounds like a stark contrast to what we expect today. Was there anyone who helped navigate these complex social landscapes and practicalities?
Indeed, long before algorithms, there was the matchmaker, known as a shadchan in Jewish tradition, a nakodo in Japan, or a go-between. This figure was a professional intermediary, end quote. They intimately knew the social landscape, identified compatible pairings, negotiated introductions, and steered things toward a successful engagement. They were part social worker, part gossip network, and part contract lawyer.
So they were the human database. They knew all the unspoken histories, the temperaments, the hidden debts. It's information that a formal social gathering simply couldn't produce.
Precisely. The matchmaker was the database, and the database was human, end quote. In Ashkenazi Jewish communities, families approached them with specific requirements, a daughter of good character, a son with a trade. The shadchan proposed candidates, arranged meetings, negotiated terms, and collected a fee. The system was practical. The matchmaker's approach was more honest about what marriage was for than the romantic model that followed it, end quote. It acknowledged that a lifetime partnership involved families, finances, temperament, and values, all the things that passionate early attraction is designed to make you ignore.
It sounds like a very rational, grounded approach to what we now consider a highly emotional decision. And this system, in various forms, still exists today, doesn't it?
It does. Matchmaking services still exist in dozens of cultures worldwide, end quote. From traditional community-based systems to high-end luxury matchmakers, the medium has changed, but the function hasn't. People still want someone who knows the landscape to point them in the right direction.
Moving from the highly structured East to the American West in the 19th century, I imagine things were very different. What happened when all those social rules simply didn't apply?
The American West was a place of profound demographic imbalance, end quote, with men vastly outnumbering women. The usual social structures hadn't formed. Resourceful men adapted, often through matrimonial advertisements in newspapers. A man would describe himself favorably, specify what he sought, and invite correspondence. Women in the East or Midwest, facing limited local options, might read several and begin a correspondence.
So the 19th century equivalent of online dating, but through letters, that must have come with its own risks and deceptions.
It did. Both parties had an incentive to present themselves favorably, so deception was a genuine risk and arrival was sometimes a shock, end quote. Men described as prosperous farmers might be living in a one-room sod house. Women might not be what their letters implied. The in-person meeting, after weeks of correspondence, could go spectacularly right or spectacularly wrong, end quote. But what's remarkable is how often it worked. Women made these journeys with clear eyes about what they were entering: a hard life, a new place, a stranger for a husband, end quote. They were making a calculated choice, often from limited alternatives. These marriages, when they held, were sometimes built on a foundation of practical compatibility and mutual respect, end quote, something the more romantic Eastern courtships didn't always produce.
It really stripped away the ceremony, revealing the core essentials of a workable marriage. And the letters themselves, they must have been incredibly important for establishing that connection across such distances.
They were. Postal courtship built a complete picture of the other from handwriting, vocabulary, and disclosed details. The stakes were extraordinary. You were agreeing to travel, marry a stranger, and start a life based on correspondence that could be, and sometimes was, entirely fictional. Photographs helped, offering a face which was better than nothing, end quote, though these formal studio portraits were often completely expressionless, end quote.
So the real insight came from the words themselves, not just the image.
Precisely. The quality of the prose, the vocabulary, the rhythm of sentences. People read these things with the attention of literary critics because the stakes warranted it, end quote. Letters also created a peculiar intimacy. Writing to someone you'd never met across a distance produced a frankness unavailable in person. You said things in letters you couldn't say in a parlor. The correspondence became a space where two people talked more honestly than polite society usually allowed.
It sounds like a very powerful, albeit risky way to build a connection. And the danger, of course, was that the person on paper might not be the person you met.
That's right. The gap between self-presentation in letters and actual personality in person could be significant, end quote. People omitted things, presenting the best version of themselves week after week, end quote, which isn't the version that shows up after a bad night's sleep, but postal courtship fundamentally reveals that people have always been willing to take considerable risks for the possibility of genuine connection, end quote. The desire to find someone is strong enough to override sensible caution.
It's a testament to that enduring human drive. Beyond letters, another crucial social event for interaction was the formal dance. What were the rules and implications of dancing in these earlier eras?
The formal dance was one of the few genuinely exciting social occasions at which young men and women could interact in a semi-supervised but physically proximal way, end quote. Every element was rule-governed: who you danced with, how many times, what you said. Dancing too frequently with the same partner implied an attachment, end quote. And then there was the waltz.
The scandalous waltz, I've heard. What made it so controversial?
When the waltz arrived in England and America in the early 19th century, the reaction was extraordinary. Lord Byron called it lascivious. It was considered dangerously intimate, end quote. A young man placed his hand on a young woman's waist. They moved in close rotation for minutes. Their bodies, closer than social convention, had previously permitted outside of a medical examination, end quote. The waltz genuinely changed what a dance could do.
That's quite an image. And the dance card played a role in all this formality, didn't it?
It was a social technology deployed to manage all of this, end quote. A young woman received a card listing the dances, and gentlemen would request specific dances in advance. A full card meant you were in demand, An empty one was a public humiliation, and if a card that showed the same name more than twice or three times was raising eyebrows across the room, end quote, because everyone understood its implications. Conversation during the dance itself was unique. You couldn't be easily overheard, allowing for whispers and confessions that wouldn't happen in a parlor. The supper dance was the most significant, as your partner for it accompanied you to supper, making a statement that everyone noticed.
So much meaning packed into such a short, physically close interaction. It truly was a high-stakes performance. Moving into the early 20th century, did these rigid Victorian courtship customs begin to relax or just transform?
They transformed into a different kind of performance, end quote, of leisurely social occasions like Edwardian lawn parties, garden fetes, and country house weekends. These were theaters of Edwardian courtship, end quote, where any real feeling had to be buried so deeply under layers of pleasantry that it would take an archaeologist to locate it, end quote.
So still highly controlled, but with more time for interaction in these extended proximity environments like a country house weekend.
Exactly. You'd spend 2.5 days with the same group, eating, walking, playing games. This offered more sustained access to the actual texture of a person's character, end quote, than parlor calls. Yet the rules of indirection still applied. A young man would engineer situations to talk to a young woman, and she would respond with enough warmth to encourage without enough directness to be considered forward, end quote. The Edwardian period was the last gasp of this elaborate performance before the First World War dismantled the world that had produced it, end quote. After the war, the argument for waiting politely and saying nothing meaningful became much harder to make.
The sheer scale of loss from World War I must have drastically changed perspectives. So, what happened when the elaborate performance was finally detonated?
The 1920s didn't gently nudge courtship, they detonated them, end quote. The chaperoned parlor visit gave way to unsupervised automobile rides. The flapper did not ask permission to be interesting. She simply was, loudly and without apology, end quote. The automobile was the single most transformative technology because it provided something courtship had never had, genuine privacy, end quote. A couple could drive away from watchful eyes, an unprecedented development that alarmed parents and moral reformers.
So the car literally drove courtship out of the public eye and into private spaces. And the new social spaces of the 20s, like jazz clubs and speakeasies, also changed how people interacted, I assume.
They offered physical expression as a form of romantic communication, end quote. New dances like the Charleston were fast and close, entirely different from supervised waltzes. Women smoked, drank, and expressed opinions directly. The language of courtship became faster, more colloquial, more honest about physical attraction, end quote. The elaborate machinery of formal courtship had been held in place not by any deep human preference for indirection, but by a set of social rules maintained by community pressure, family authority, and the economic vulnerability of women, end quote. When those pressures relaxed, the machinery came apart with startling speed, leaving something messier, louder, less certain, and for many people considerably more alive.
A genuine paradigm shift. And this leads directly to the concept of the date, as we understand it, right? Two people explicitly evaluating compatibility.
Yes, the concept of going on a date, end quote, is a surprisingly modern invention, emerging in the early 20th century as young people gained economic independence and mobility. The soda fountain was one of the first public spaces for this new courtship, where a couple could talk without a chaperone. The word date itself, from the root of diary date, implied a scheduled, casual occurrence, two people choosing each other's company, going somewhere together, and seeing what happened, end quote.
And the man was expected to pay, which shifted the dynamic considerably from the parlor visits. This gave him a new kind of authority in these commercial spaces.
It did. The date moved the action out of the home, where the woman held social sway, and into commercial spaces that the man paid for, giving him authority. Whether this was an improvement would be a question feminists raised later. The movie theater also became a crucial venue. Darkened, anonymous, it provided 90 minutes of shared experience without requiring either party to produce continuous conversation. End quote. Perfect for early romantic evaluation.
The movie theater, still a classic first date, and the drive-in added the privacy of the car back into that equation, allowing privacy, proximity, and a windshield as the only barrier, end quote, to everything parents worried about.
Exactly. The date gave people agency, end quote, the ability to choose individually without family management who to spend time with. It also gave them the new experience of failing a date, end quote, and having to see it through to the end, a skill previous generations never needed.
A skill we're still perfecting, apparently. By the 1950s, American courtship had developed its own rituals, most notably going steady.
Going steady was a highly ritualized system, end quote, where a young couple declared themselves exclusive. It wasn't just a private understanding, it was announced and symbolized by the transfer of a class ring or a letter jacket. These items were worn visibly by the girl to communicate to everyone around her that she was taken, end quote.
So a social broadcast making commitment visible. It sounds like a formalized pre-engagement stage practice for a serious relationship.
Precisely. It offered a framework for practicing commitment, fidelity, communication, presenting as a couple without the full legal and economic ties of marriage. You got to practice before the stakes became permanent, end quote. And the physical markers were taken seriously. Returning a letter jacket or ring was a breakup in material form, end quote. There was no ambiguous fade. There was no soft ghosting. The end of the relationship was as visible as its beginning.
Unambiguous indeed, a stark contrast to some modern practices. And then the telephone emerged, changing everything again, especially the anxiety around communication.
The domestic telephone, becoming nearly universal by mid-century, allowed two people to speak directly, in real time, with a degree of privacy neither the parlor nor the chaperoned walk allowed. This was thrilling, but also terrifying. You had to pick up the phone, dial, and know any member of their household might answer, end quote. Parental interception was one of the great underappreciated anxieties of mid-century courtship, end quote.
So a different kind of supervised intimacy. The conversation was conducted knowing anyone might be listening, and rules emerged around telephone calls, right?
Yes, you didn't call too early, too late, or too frequently, as frequency implied desperation. You didn't speak too long, which tied up the line. What the telephone gave was tone, end quote, the actual sound of another person's voice, revealing nervousness, warmth, hesitation. The voice was uncontrollable in a way that writing was not. It revealed things, end quote. Asking someone on a date by phone required specific courage, end quote. The willingness to propose something real-time and hear the answer instantly with no buffer for composure.
That takes a certain kind of nerve, hearing a rejection in real time. Before dating apps and the internet, if you weren't meeting someone through traditional channels, there were personals, weren't there?
Yes, small, compressed, desperately earnest advertisements placed in the back pages of newspapers and magazines, end quote. The personal ad had a long history, but by the 20th century, it had evolved into a few lines of self-description, a few lines of what one was seeking, and a box number to write to, end quote. This was an act of considerable social courage, end quote, as it implied you hadn't found someone through normal channels carrying real stigma.
So people used them but often kept it quiet, and they developed their own coded language.
Absolutely. WLTM for would like to meet, GSOH for good sense of humor, NS for non-smoker, OHAC for own house and car. This vocabulary was a code for regular readers. The self-description was where human optimism met the constraints of available column inches, end quote. About 40 words to explain yourself. People tended to describe physical appearance first, then profession, and then character, end quote. The box number reply was its own ritual, writing a real letter, sending it to a number, and the paper forwarding it. It was slow and uncertain, but could sustain across several exchanges before meeting in person.
It sounds like a slower, more deliberate form of what we now do online. The stakes were still quite high, I imagine, because you were making a public declaration, even if anonymously, that you were seeking a partner.
Precisely. And it leads us to the 1960s, where the sexual revolution detonated many of these established courtship customs. The widespread availability of the birth control pill from 1960 onwards was a huge factor. For the first time in human history, women had access to a reliable, female-controlled method of contraception that was entirely separable from the act itself. End quote. This significantly loosened the link between sexual activity and potential consequences.
The pill truly was a game changer. It challenged the centuries-old assumption that a woman's romantic value was tied to sexual unavailability. This must have been genuinely liberating for many, but perhaps confusing for others.
It created a culture of deliberate informality around romantic and physical arrangements that was both genuinely liberating and genuinely confusing. End quote. The idea that physical intimacy didn't necessarily constitute a commitment or mean anything specific about the future was new. For many women, it offered real freedom to make choices about their bodies and romantic lives. For others, the dismantling of the old rules created a new pressure. End quote. An implicit expectation that the old protections against sexual pressure no longer applied, and that refusal might now seem old-fashioned.
So the sexual revolution wasn't a straightforward story of progress. It was a complex renegotiation of power, moving quickly and without a script, and it fundamentally changed the assumption that romantic pursuit was necessarily heading toward marriage.
That's right. Dating became a thing people did without a clear destination in view. End quote. Living together without marriage became first scandalous, then notable, then ordinary. The staged progression from meeting to courtship to engagement to marriage, the pipeline that the entire Victorian machinery had been designed to manage, became optional. End quote. Which, depending on your perspective, was either the best thing or the beginning of a long period of uncertainty.
That uncertainty, a hallmark of modern dating, leads directly to another question that arose from the feminist movements of this era: who pays for dinner?
It sounds trivial, but it was embedded in a much larger question about what dating was actually for and what the exchange of money at a restaurant table was symbolizing. End quote. The traditional model where the man paid carried implied assumptions about economic positions, who was pursuing whom, and what was expected in return. Feminism pointed out that these assumptions were worth examining.
So the man paying signaled his ability to provide, reinforcing a woman's economic dependence. Going Dutch then became a political statement, asserting independence and equality.
Exactly. Women who insisted on paying their share were signaling independence, refusing the dynamic that the traditional arrangement implied. End quote. But this wasn't universally welcomed. Men socialized to see paying as respect found it insulting. Women sometimes felt they were sacrificing the feeling of being valued, sought, provided for. This conversation has never fully resolved. Surveys still find mixed expectations about who should pay, indicating that people are simultaneously operating from two different frameworks, end quote, the old and the new.
That awkward moment with the restaurant check really is a perfect microcosm of modern courtship, caught between inherited scripts and revised values. As we move into the late 20th century, technology continued to reshape things. The answering machine, for instance, introduced a whole new kind of romantic anxiety.
The answering machine created the experience of asynchronous romantic rejection, end quote. The message left that went unreturned, the voice that disappeared into a tape and simply never came back to you. Screening calls became a common practice. The receiver of calls had an enormous advantage, able to evaluate a message at leisure and decide whether to call back. The message itself was a performance under conditions of high anxiety and zero preparation time, end quote.
And the hang-up was the answering machine era's version of ghosting, wasn't it?
Yes, you'd call, the machine would answer, you'd lose your nerve, say nothing, and hang up, leaving no evidence before caller ID. This brief window of plausibly deniable telephone cowardice was short-lived. The 3-day rule, waiting 3 days to call after a date, was a direct product of this culture. It was a rule about performed indifference, end quote, often leading to perfectly mutual indifference, where both parties waited, pretending not to care.
So much romantic possibility died in those 3 days. And this brings us to another technological bridge, video dating services. These were a precursor to online dating, right?
They were. Appearing in the late 1970s and flourishing through the 80s and 90s, video dating services were the first time that technology had been used specifically to create a marketplace for romantic possibility, end quote. People paid to record short introductory videos, which other subscribers could watch. The experience required a commitment of money and self-exposure, filtering out the casually curious.
So you'd go to an office, sit in front of a camera, and describe yourself. It sounds incredibly awkward.
They were, by any standard, excruciating, end quote. People sat stiffly describing hobbies like tennis or cooking in generic terms, seeking someone who enjoys laughing or is ready for something real. The videos communicated very little about the actual person and a great deal about how the actual person imagined an attractive romantic prospect presented themselves, end quote. Yet people found partners. These services offered a face and a voice that personal ads couldn't, allowing you to gauge a quality of presence that interested you.
It's the commodification of romantic possibility that would become central to online dating, where you're both the shopper and the product. And then came the internet chat rooms, where people started falling in love without ever seeing or speaking to each other out loud.
The rise of internet chat rooms, first on services like Prodigy and CompuServe, then AOL, created a space where strangers talked in text. They discovered the feeling of being known and understood by another person could happen at a keyboard as readily as it had ever happened in person, end quote. This was unsettling to those who thought romance required physical presence. It turned out it mostly required the right kind of conversation, end quote.
The anonymity must have been a huge factor, allowing for a different kind of honesty.
Yes, the absence of physical appearance removed a variable that ordinarily dominated early romantic valuation. For the funny, articulate, or interesting in prose, this was an extraordinary equalizer, end quote. Relationships developed with detailed knowledge of someone's mind, humor, history, and fears, without knowing what they looked like. The intimacy was real. The knowledge was partial. The combination was intoxicating and occasionally disastrous, end quote. Meeting in person after this was a defining experience, often a shock as the person you'd built in your imagination met the real one. It introduced the idea that a relationship could have a genuinely meaningful history before it had any physical dimension, end quote.
Which brings us to online dating as we know it, starting with Match.com in 1995. Initially, it was stigmatized, seen as for the lonely or desperate, right?
Absolutely. For the first decade, most users told their friends and families that they had met their partner some other way, end quote. The stigma took about 10 years to dissolve, but it did under the weight of numbers. By the mid-2000s, doctors, lawyers, attractive, successful people were using it. They found that being socially capable didn't reliably solve the problem of meeting compatible people, especially in large cities.
So it became normalized because it worked for so many, especially when traditional channels were proving insufficient in modern urban life, and the profile became the new art form.
Yes, a strange one, end quote. A few photographs, a short description, and fields for age, height, location. Photographs were the dominant element, end quote, shaping most decisions. This was, in some ways, depressing, a return to the primacy of physical appearance, end quote, but also simply honest about how human attention actually operates. The written profile became a minor literary genre with its own recognizable conventions and its own reliable cliches, end quote. Everyone loved to laugh, was equally comfortable in jeans and a cocktail dress, and was looking for adventure.
All very generic, but what online dating truly changed was the sheer size of the field of potential partners.
Precisely. Instead of your existing social network, online dating meant meeting people who shared no prior social context with you, end quote. This was both the promise and the problem. The field was enormous, the strangers genuinely strange, and the work of evaluating them, one profile at a time, was more labor-intensive than anyone had initially anticipated. End quote.
And if online dating expanded the field, text messaging radically reshaped the daily texture of romantic pursuit.
Texting made near-constant contact possible, but also allowed the withdrawal of that contact to be felt with a precision that no previous generation had ever experienced. The text thread became a record of a relationship's emotional temperature. People read meaning into response times, punctuation, emoji. The read receipt was a particular instrument of modern romantic torment, end quote. Informing you a message was read but not responded to. Previous generations had their own versions of unreturned communication, end quote, but with plausible deniability. The read receipt eliminated that.
So no more, they must be busy. Just the stark reality of they read it and chose not to respond. And the speed of texting created new anxieties around availability.
Yes, texting created the expectation of availability, end quote, that a person was reachable and actively choosing whether to reach back. Every non-reply was a decision. Every delay was something to interpret. It also created an enormous archive, end quote. Unlike old letters or photos, the daily communication was automatically recorded, allowing you to scroll back and analyze for the moment things had changed, end quote. The double text became a coded act of emotional exposure, end quote, caring enough to risk appearing to care too much.
That's a lot of emotional weight placed on tiny digital cues. And then Tinder arrived, fundamentally changing the architecture of the decision itself.
Tinder, launching in 2013, made the swipe one of the defining acts of modern romantic life. It transformed the first encounter from a social event into a solo sorting exercise conducted in private at any hour in any location, based almost entirely on a photograph and a brief self-description, end quote. The design was deliberately, brilliantly frictionless. You looked, judged, swiped in less time than it takes to read a sentence.
It really gamified the initial connection, producing dopamine spikes to encourage continued use. But was it engineered to produce relationships or just engagement with the app?
That's the key. The match was not the relationship, end quote. It was just the beginning of a conversation that might lead somewhere, but the gap between matching and a real connection was wide and full of obstacles. The opening message, the conversation that builds momentum, translating from text to human presence, all these points where connection could fail. The match was the easy part. Everything after it was as hard as it had ever been, end quote.
And this swipe culture also introduced a paradox of choice. When the next potential match is always one swipe away, it must be harder to invest in any individual person.
That's the profound impact. The investment in any individual person becomes harder to sustain, end quote. Why work through the friction of knowing one imperfect person when the app constantly suggests a better option? The scarcity that previously forced decisive commitment has been replaced by an abundance that makes commitment feel perpetually premature, end quote. The irony is, the app designed to make meeting people easier may have made committing to people harder.
An interesting, if depressing, paradox. And speaking of commitment, or rather the lack thereof, ghosting has become a recognized, normalized way of ending things.
Ghosting is the practice of simply ceasing all communication with someone you'd been romantically involved with without explanation, end quote. It became a cultural discussion in the 2010s because it produces a specific kind of distress that is difficult to resolve precisely because it provides no information. Ending a relationship is hard, and ghosting allows someone to remove themselves without triggering hurt, anger, or argument.
So, from the ghost's perspective, it's efficient and painless, but for the person ghosted, it's a peculiar limbo.
Exactly. A formal letter of refusal or a phone call ending things conveyed something specific. This is over and I am the one ending it. Ghosting communicates nothing specific. It could mean a dozen things, end quote, leaving the ghosted person in uncertainty, its own particular cruelty, end quote. Modern ghosting often occurs between people who share no social context, amplifying the total disappearance. There is no community gossip to fill the silence. There is no mutual friend to ask, only the silent thread.
The quiet monument to something that apparently didn't mean enough to be ended properly. And what about a more nebulous modern phenomenon, the situationship?
The situationship is a romantic entanglement with the emotional texture of a relationship and none of its acknowledged terms, end quote. It's sustained by a mutual, implicit agreement not to ask the question that would force a definitive answer. Two people developing genuine feelings but carefully avoiding the conversation that would require either of them to say what any of it meant. It's a product of an environment where commitment is optional and the cost of not committing is reduced to manageable social awkwardness.
So it's a masterpiece of emotional risk management, as you put it, but at what cost to the person who wants more clarity?
The cost is almost always paid by the person who wanted more and waited too long to say so, end quote. The ambiguity favors the person with less investment. This phenomenon highlights the absence of formal courtship rituals. Past generations had elaborate systems like calling cards or engagement announcements that made a relationship's status legible. The situationship is what you get when all those legibility mechanisms are removed and replaced with nothing, end quote.
It sounds like a fitting, if somewhat depressing, romantic experience for our current era. Finally, how has modern technology changed the very geography of love, making long-distance relationships not just possible but common?
For most of history, love was a local phenomenon. You fell for someone within your daily radius. Long-distance love was a temporary problem awaiting a geographical solution. But modern technology has changed this so thoroughly that long-distance relationships are now a recognized and fairly common feature of romantic life, end quote. Two people can meet online, develop a relationship through screens for months or years, and feel they know each other deeply before ever being in the same room.
And the video call has made that possible by adding face and movement to the voice, giving a visible context to someone's life.
Yes, it is enough of the same that feelings develop and sustain in ways that a telephone line alone could not reliably produce, end quote. Long-distance relationships require deliberateness more than anything. Every act of connection has to be chosen consciously. Scheduled calls, planned visits. There is no coasting, there is no being together by default. Everything is on purpose, end quote. This enforced deliberateness can actually be a strength, as couples don't take each other for granted.
That's a fascinating silver lining to the challenges of distance. The reunion visit must carry immense weight, testing whether the screen connection translates to physical comfort.
It does. The first time two people who know each other well in one medium discover whether that knowledge translates into actual physical comfort, end quote. Sometimes it is, and when the ease survives the translation, there's a specific quality of relief and recognition, end quote. The person you knew online is also this person in front of you. You were right about them. Across all that distance, you were right.
What an incredible journey through the history of human connection. From arranged marriages to swiping left, it seems the underlying human desire, that wanting, the hoping, the careful, vulnerable act of showing someone who you are and waiting to see what they do with it, end quote, has never changed. The tools change. The courage required remains constant.
Indeed, all the elaborate social mechanisms humans invented to manage the terrifying business of wanting someone and not knowing if they wanted you back, end quote, were just different costumes for the same fundamental impulse. Think of the Victorian woman in her uncomfortable chair, or the frontier man sending a letter into the silence, or the 1980s teenager rehearsing a phone call. They were all doing the same thing you have done, end quote, reaching towards someone, hoping to be reached back. The preserved love letters, the folded calling cards, the dance cards, the matrimonial ads, they all show, underneath the costumes of whatever era produced it, two people trying to find each other, end quote.
And they often had fewer choices, less freedom, and harsher social consequences than we do. But in many ways, they were braver because the wanting was bigger than the system. It always was. The question of what romantic attention is supposed to mean and whether it requires the choice to have been difficult remains. This in-depth look at courtship's evolution, highlighting how generations have navigated love and connection, has been truly enlightening.
It shows that while the methods change, the human desire for connection and the vulnerability involved are timeless. The question of how to demonstrate you mean it in a world where demonstration has become nearly costless is still being answered.
If this conversation resonated with you, share it with someone who understands the modern dating dilemma.